Hi, I'm Phil Howard, and this is the latest installment of our Media and Change series, a video series for the Center for Media, Data and Society at CEU. Today my guest is Jennifer Schradie, who comes to us from Toulouse and is here for a lecture and to visit the campus. Welcome.
Thanks, Phil.
So my goal for maybe 20 minutes would be to talk about France and the French internet, and maybe in a comparative perspective, because I know your area of expertise is the US. And, I'm curious to know, I guess, what your first impressions were on landing in Toulouse about how French political culture online is different from what you've studied in the US.
That's a really good question. Well, the very first experience I had was going on Google. And of course, in France, you are constantly getting warnings about privacy and ways in which there are a number of people who have chosen not to be on Google anymore, right? So you have, from the get-go, kind of a different setup. Politically, I think that France, has this reputation of being kind of behind the times. You're probably familiar with the history of the Minitel, which France actually had the internet before anyone else did. These very interesting machines way back in the 80s where people could go online and interact with the government for services. But because it didn't allow people to interact with people outside of France, the Minitel eventually died, right? So in some respects then, France has been playing catch up in terms of internet use. However, because France has a more unified state system than, for example, in the US, as you said, I'm more familiar with the American case. Once, whether it's French government associations or ways in which the public can interact with the government online, once they launch that, I've been surprised the extent to which how much easier and simpler it is than the US, right? And we all know about the unfortunate initial disaster of Obamacare when it first launched online, right? There were a lot of private companies involved, and what I've found in France is that, so there's that piece of kind of systematically things, I've been surprised the extent to which, how quickly they're functioning. And then the other question is, what about digital politics, right? How are people communicating online? How are politicians themselves communicating online? And that's an area that I'm just beginning to explore. And I think where that really came to light was most recently after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, right? Where the satirical magazine journalists and other people were killed in the attack in Paris. And there was an enormous reaction online, again, with this very unifying hashtag, Je suis Charlie, and I think a lot of French politicians, knew that this was, obviously this was a very big event for France, but to speak specifically around the internet, really tried to capitalize, in some ways kind of exploit the popularity of this way in which not only people in France but around the world were really kind of embracing this issue together in a unifying way. And it was also really funny to watch how, so there were a number of protests all around France after the killings, the weekend afterwards, and it was interesting how the president really tried to shape what the hashtag was going to be, right?
In the sense of choosing the characters or defining the topics that
defining, so, basically like marche républicain, like a Republican, like a national, basically in French it means like a unifying march, right? But some people felt it kind of veered a little too nationalistic. Other people just called it a unity march. Other people had different words for it. So I think in some ways, though, my opinion is that the way in which French politics are engaged with the internet really reflects what's happening on a political level rather than just a digital level.
At a digital level. And is your sense, I guess, over the long term, that the French internet is about resisting the Silicon Valley's innovations, or duplicating, mimicking and duplicating, or maybe it's just slow to catch up? So you've referred to being slow to catch up and trying to build infrastructure that was similar to what's available in the West, but with its own French twist.
Right. That's an excellent question. I'm smiling because I think there's a connection there with the whole Charlie Hebdo issue, in that there's just a very strong French way of, and political way of talking about politics and economics in a very satirical manner. Right, so I'm constantly seeing critiques of Silicon Valley, some that are somewhat satirical, but that some are very serious, right? That I think you don't really get as much in the U.S., right? Critiquing, Google and Facebook and all these companies that think they can just come in.
And holding them responsible, right?
Pardon?
And maybe even holding them responsible for the content.
Exactly. Right. So you had referred earlier to the whole issue with, with Twitter and this sense that what happens on Twitter or Facebook, that it isn't just this American idea of free speech, or which is tethered to free markets or freedom from the state, but that speech has implications and consequences, right? So whether it's trying to hold Twitter or these other tech companies accountable, or whether that's allowing people to take their personal images off of the internet.
Right, the right to forget.
Exactly, the right to forget.
And so one of the things that's innovative about your own research is your look at class in the US context, and the different ways that class dynamics play out in social activism. Have you noticed similar things in France, or is class also an important way of an important framework for analyzing media trends in France?
That's something that I'm just beginning to explore, and I think what I really want to investigate a little bit is, first of all, there are very similar digital divide statistics in France and the US. And what I'm trying to figure out is this an adoption curve question, right? So that's just a fancy way of saying, since the French were a little late, so to speak, in getting online, does that mean that eventually the poor and working class in France will catch up more than those in the United States? And that's kind of my working hypothesis, that France is investing a lot of money into digital infrastructure, and there's a lot more social support for the French poor and working class as compared to the US. So there's that question of access, but then there's also going to be that question of content production. And I think you and I have talked about literacy rates in the past, and how literacy rates might explain technology adoption, and the ability of certain groups to contribute or not contribute. Right? If there's no content online and you can't do sophisticated search, then the internet might be a less fun place to be. Right. And France has free education for everyone, right, as compared to the US. So I think that would be an interesting question. But in terms of, there are a number of factors that go into if and how people are actually creating online content, at least with my research in the US. And certainly educational level is huge, is a big factor, which relates to skill. But there's also some really interesting research around feeling empowered or entitled, or having the confidence to participate online, and also owning the digital means of production, right? So.
You mean the intellectual property of what?
No, owning, having ready 24/7, 24 hours, 7 days a week, access to gadgets and tools, right? So those of us who have maybe a laptop and a smartphone and maybe an iPad
and another
or
workstation,
and another workstation, right? That I think we tend to forget that not everyone has that access. And yes, people can go to the library, or oftentimes poor and working class folks may go to a relative's house, or maybe they have it at work or at home, but having access at home, at work, and mobile really makes a big difference in predicting whether or not people will blog or tweet or use Facebook. Participate online in this political dialogue.
I suppose the nice thing about working now in Toulouse is that you can observe some of these different cultures of use at work. And I imagine there are different organizations always treat technologies in different ways. Are there patterns to how French organizations treat information technology in the workplace?
Absolutely. So there is a French law in place that employers cannot require their employees to send or receive email after work hours, so about 6 p.m., which is very different from the American culture where you're just expected to be tethered online all the time. And again, I think there is, while I study politics and the state, I do feel like there are some cultural differences where, again, one of the first things I noticed when I moved to France was I saw far fewer people walking around with their smartphones on public transportation or just walking around.
And I'm sorry, is there a generational split there, or would you say, does this count for younger folks too?
I think across the board. I mean, my understanding of the statistics in France, it's similar to the US, that of course younger people are adopting digital technology at faster rates, but in terms of people being really tethered to their digital gadgets, I'm not seeing that as much, and also not, and again, that you asked about workplace issues, people take time for lunch, and again, where
they don't answer email over lunch,
where Americans eat at their desk and are working constantly. So yeah,
I've noticed, and this is just an anecdote, that people I write to in the UK now are much more likely to respond with GPG signed messages, and I think it's because of what the GCHQ, the English Government Security Services, are doing online to watch traffic in the UK context. And so this defensive posturing has come out where people actually want to learn about privacy protections and are using them in the workplace, providing their signatures and providing their public keys and making it possible to write each other encrypted messages. Have you noticed that in your own networks? Or do people seem to have some literacy with encryption, or is it not serious enough to?
That's an excellent question. I have not noticed it one way or the other in France, but I would suspect that there would be even more of a desire to maintain that sense of privacy, which again, I'm, even just going to, a store, signing up for something and putting my email address in, there are a number of boxes that you tick, to ensure that you have privacy. And there's, even at my children's schools, they refuse to give out other parents, email addresses, which again is very, very different from the US. So I think there's just a baseline in France where the question of privacy isn't as much a question as it is in the US. It's an understanding. Okay,
and so having, being an expert in the state, would you say that is an EU thing or a French government? Is the French government sort of inclined, the French state, inclined to protect privacy that way, or do they do it in funny centralized ways that the French state does in other policy domains?
So your question is around, is this an EU
this privacy
issue?
value, the privacy value, I'm just wondering whether it comes out, if it's there because of the political culture, or if it's there because the government values it, the state values it, or whether it's an EU, sort of a late in the game EU adjustment.
Right, I'm sure, my sense is overall the EU is more concerned about privacy than the US, and then there are differences within the EU. But I mean, France is definitely up there in terms of very historically and culturally interested in privacy, and so in some ways it's hard to really separate this question out. Is it kind of a historical cultural thing, or is it the state? Because I think the two are entwined.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then I guess the last question I'd love to ask you is about social activism online. Mm-hmm. For those of us who studied social media and political activism, I think some of us were excited for a while about how minorities and the poor might use digital media to organize in ways they hadn't otherwise. Compared to the US, do you see minorities, voices that aren't part of the mainstream political conversation, are they using social media in creative ways, or is there not as much energy as we hoped for at one point?
So you're asking about the US case.
Yeah.
Even though I'm a digital inequality scholar,
Mm-hmm.
I was shocked at the extent to which there is such a large digital activist gap between the working class and the middle to upper class.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, with one data set I have around this one political issue, where there are a number of groups organizing around this issue, out of 20,000 tweets, only one was from a working class organization, right? So statistically zero. And I think you're right. And there are some statistics that do show that, for example, African Americans, once they're online, are much more likely to tweet. I did this study around, that they're much more likely to blog. But that's once folks are online, right? But then but African Americans are less likely to be online in the first place.
Right.
So in many ways, we have a deepening digital politics gap, I think.
There's also these interesting moments where something that happens in public life, like the Ferguson riots, draws in people, and
Yes.
I've heard other experts argue that has drawn in African Americans to use Twitter. I mean, for more than culture, but for politics as well. Has Charlie Hebdo drawn in people in France in ways that they might not have? Has that attracted new people to using social media for political conversations that they wouldn't have before? Or?
That's an excellent question. I think the jury is still out. It's just been a few weeks. Anecdotally, from most of the people that I talked to, were not getting their news on Twitter, French citizens. I mean, certainly people were using it. I was addicted to it as I was trying to follow what was going on minute by minute. But I think, the question of Ferguson or Charlie Hebdo, I think that the reality is that perhaps certainly, I think when you have an event like that, my hypothesis would be that yes, more people might turn to social media and any form of media to get information, but that you still have a growing elite, digital elite online, who have a really high number of followers, if we're talking about Twitter, higher number of retweets if someone actually posts. So there is a big gap on Twitter itself, for example. And I think that's something else to consider. Yes, anyone can post on Twitter. Yes, anyone can post on any form of social media, but who is really going to hear them?
Who's really going to hear them, yeah. Well, thank you very much for today's conversation. Sure. My guest has been Jennifer Schradie, and thank you.
Thank you.